This is Reality Dispatch, written by Jim Mins.
Do-yoon was asleep on his couch. He had dozed off after embarking on a streaming binge that began at dinner and did not end. He welcomed the solace that only living alone provided. He did not miss Gwen. He would tell anyone who asked. In truth, he missed her every moment his mind wandered. His friends began to worry about 3 months earlier when, just like a bear, he had embraced hibernation. Always a social butterfly, this change in his persona troubled them to the point where they would bombard his phone with messages of invitations to any events that were taking place on their social calendars night in and night out. He was wise to their antics and regularly wrote back in all caps, insulting demands to leave him be, to allow him to grieve, to allow him to accept that he was to be a single man living alone, pushing his mid-30s, and that the expectations he had for himself had drastically changed. Ha-jun accepted the excuse not to partake as a sign that he would be fine in the long run. The problematic text came from Eun-woo, who would not believe that Do-yoon was not at risk of self-harm. It was exhausting, especially as Eun-woo continued a dialogue with Gwen, which caused Do-yoon ongoing discomfort. As he was asleep, his emotions were at bay, and he could relax in the comfort of slumber. This was interrupted at 11 p.m. that evening when his phone exploded in a series of rings and messages that were not subdued as usual. Wen Do-yoon would have silenced his phone before sleep. He attempted to ignore them, placing the couch cushion over his face, then ears, squeezing it tighter to drown out the noise. The phone was on the other side of the living room, too far to ignore. "What is it?" he said, answering blindly, not knowing the instigator of the call but believing it to be, as always, Eun-woo. "You need to come with us. We're gathering everyone on the streets," said Gwen's voice. Do-yoon was bending his knees to return to the couch when the sound of her voice caused him to stand up erect. "Gwen?" "Hello, Do-yoon. How are you? Look, I know it's been many months since we last spoke. Please come out and march with us. We are calling everyone to join us. The president just declared martial law," she explained. Martial law? He was unfamiliar with the term in a modern context. His mind wandered to an earlier time some 20 years ago. He was sitting in history class. It was the 8th grade, and his teacher was going through a checklist of major events that occurred in modern Korean politics. That's right, democracy has just died. Tonight, we need to march to the capital, now. He threw on his hoodie and made his way outside his apartment. Others had a similar idea, for there were many young Koreans who, like Do-yoon, lived in the city, leaving their apartments behind to take to the streets. Do-yoon felt foolish for having been cajoled by his emotions towards his ex-love, and not by the disgust and outrage that everyone else seemed to be emoting. Under the sign for the bakers near the metro, Do-yoon spotted Gwen, Eun-woo, and others he did not know, gather around, painting crude signs with oversized Sharpie pens on repurposed pizza boxes. They greeted him with head nods as he arrived. Gwen looked up and smiled, and then remembered and removed her smile. She looked down at her cardboard sign and continued to scrawl her indignation. She ran her hand vigorously on the material, and Do-yoon wondered if she had employed this much veracity to the message before he'd arrived in the circle. "All right, we're all here," announced Eun-woo. "Let's march." They joined the mob like a branch floating down the riverbed. At first, the mood was jovial and brotherly. There were smiles across the attendees. Laughs could be heard. They marched along major roads where cars were wise enough not to be on the bitumen that night. It wasn't until Do-yoon spotted the first tank that the chants began to erupt. "Yoon Suk-yeol has got to go," they began. Do-yoon looked around and everyone was in agreement. He looked to Gwen, who felt his eyes and looked back. She quickly looked away once more, eager not to make eye contact. She then looked back and smirked. Do-yoon smirked back. She laughed. He laughed back. "This is serious," she shouted. "Don't laugh." "I'm not laughing," he replied. "You are. We are under martial law, and you're flirting with me?" "I'm not flirting with you. I was asleep 10 minutes ago." They marched on when the crowd began to bank together closer than before. There was a roadblock that caused the masses to stop. Do-yoon stood on his tiptoes to get a better vantage. "What is it?" Gwen asked. "The military," Do-yoon explained. He could see men and women in uniform making a human wall that blocked access to the capital. They each had a hand on their weapons, along with an interlocked arm around the soldier to their right and left. The army is stopping the parliament members from voting. The parliament needs a 300-person majority to overthrow the will of the president. They cannot overthrow his will if they cannot access the chamber to vote, explained Eunwoo. Maybe they're all in there, thought Do-yun. Maybe the army is protecting the vote. I hope so, said Gwen. The shouting grew louder. There was a disturbance up ahead in the front lines. Do-yun stood on his tiptoes once more to get a better look. One soldier had his gun drawn on a protester. This is not good, he said. They're pulling their guns out. Who are? Asked Gwen. The soldiers. It's martial law, said Eunwoo. We're not allowed to protest. We're not allowed to do anything. So why the hell are we here? We're going to get killed, yelled Do-yun. We're here because they said we cannot be, said Gwen. She held his hand. We're here because the government is forcing us away from having a say. They are removing our voice from that building. I don't want that to happen. We might as well move north if that happens here. Do-yun held her hand tight. He yearned for her touch again. He wanted to pinch himself to see if this was part of his dream. I do want you to have a voice, he said. I do want you to have freedom. He knew what she meant. No, you don't. You wanted control. The disturbance up ahead grew louder. The crowd erupted in yells and a few screams. There was panic. That's not true. I was just afraid. Do-yun tried to explain. I always wanted us to be here. I wanted us to start a family here. I was afraid of change and I shouldn't have been. You were so excited and I threw that all away because I was. He had rehearsed this speech over and over in his head. His thumbs were sore from typing it out and deleting it on his phone every night. Every morning at his workstation. Here he was delivering it in person in a mob of thousands under martial law. I was, he continued. She let go of his hand and he grabbed her and placed it back in his palm. The crowd surged backward and their hands were torn apart, the rush of the mob splitting them like the parting of a river. Their eyes remained locked as the crowd separated them even further. Gwen, meet me at the bakery! Do-yun attempted to yell, but it was useless. He could not even hear his own voice above the disruption and mayhem caused by the wall of the army pushing up against the protesters, pushing up against Do-yun, who had remained fixed in place on the spot where Gwen had held his hand for the first time in 4 months. He could still imagine her soft skin in his palm. Then he was knocked to the ground as a surge in people gathered speed to avoid the wrath of the armed response.
For more stories of fact-based fiction, head to jimmins.substack.com.